Do you remember this conversation with Tally from Mass Effect 2?
I caught some tension back on Freedom's Progress and again when you first came aboard. What happened between Cerberus and the Quarians?
They attacked one of our ships, the Idena. It seems they were attempting to kill or control a young human biotic who was on the fleet. I don't really know the details. I do know that Cerberus made an enemy of the Quarian people.
That's pretty much all we can learn about the tension between the Quarians and Cerberus in Mass Effect 2. But if you were ever curious to know the whole story, you'll find it in the novel Mass Effect Ascension. In this video, I'll tell you a bit about the book and then give recommendations on whether or not it's worth reading. For your convenience, this video is divided into chapters. The review section will contain spoilers for Ascension and some light spoilers for the Mass Effect trilogy, so watch with caution. Mass Effect Ascension is Drew Karpyshyn's second book in the series, and it tells the story of Kaylee Sanders, who is on a mission to protect one of her students, Jillian Grayson, from a group of Cerberus operatives looking to kidnap her in order to conduct experiments on humans with biotic potential. Sanders is on faculty at the Grissom Academy, primarily working with students in the Ascension Project, a program for children with biotic abilities. Despite Grissom Academy being an Alliance-sponsored facility, Cerberus agents lurk within the program and will hunt Jillian down until they've captured her. To ensure Jillian's safety, Sanders is forced to visit some of the most dangerous parts of the known galaxy, like the Terminus systems, and she learns that hiding from Cerberus is a far more difficult task than she anticipated. The events of the novel take place just a few months after the conclusion of Mass Effect 1. With the Citadel and the wider galaxy still sorting out the resulting chaos of the attack by Saren and his Geth forces, Kaylee's mission sparks the attention of some unexpected allies who come to her aid. Ascension is a fun read with some exciting moments, but it suffers from some weaknesses in character development and slow pacing at times. These aspects aren't enough to drag the novel down entirely, but some readers will find it more enjoyable than others. So, here are a few considerations and folks I have in mind that would benefit most from picking up this novel. Ascension was published about a year after the launch of the first Mass Effect game, so the initial target audience was likely those who finished the game and were looking for more from the franchise. Lately, with more and more folks getting interested in the series as excitement ramps up for Mass Effect 5, it would certainly be an interesting and entertaining experience to go through each piece of the wider Mass Effect franchise in release order. In other words, I can see how Ascension would be a fun read after having only played the first game in the trilogy. With that said, I'd actually recommend reading Ascension after a playthrough of Mass Effect 2. The novel features important overlaps with characters and locations from the game, and a prior familiarity with them makes for a more engaging reading experience. This approach not only deepens your understanding of the universe, but also enhances the enjoyment of Ascension, which, in my opinion, is weaker at introducing aspects from Mass Effect 2 than the game itself. Despite being a sequel to Revelation, it isn't necessary to have read the first book before jumping into Ascension. The books are set about 20 years apart and only have one character in common, Kaylee Sanders. There are references to the events of Revelation, but all of the pertinent details from that book are reiterated in the moments when they become relevant in Ascension's plot. That said, fans of the first book will probably enjoy seeing more of Sanders and what she's been up to since the last time we saw her in Revelation. One of my favorite aspects of Ascension is its settings. The locations in this novel are written with tremendous detail, giving so much depth and life to some iconic locales in the Mass Effect franchise. Omega is the best example of this. It feels seedy and truly dangerous in this book, something that is somewhat hard to convey when exploring it in Mass Effect 2. When you play as Shepard, decked out with a full arsenal and 2 squad mates, exploring Omega doesn't feel all too imposing, even though we are meant to believe so. However, reading about the characters in this book, treading carefully through the streets alone, taking back alleys or alternate routes, just to avoid accidentally stepping into a war zone or being otherwise assailed, it conveys the tension of actually being there. It also puts into better perspective the characters that call it home. All of these details come together to not only make Ascension compelling, but also to enhance the experience of playing Mass Effect 2 or Mass Effect 3's Omega DLC. Another location that similarly benefits from a wealth of detail is the Migrant Fleet. Ascension more than makes up for the fact that we only get a very small glimpse of it in the trilogy by offering an intimate look at what life is like aboard one of the flotilla's ships. Getting a tour of the Edena was awesome. Witnessing Quarians going about their normal, everyday lives isn't something often seen in Mass Effect. Their portrayal is generally more focused on the struggle to survive and the cultural mission to return to Rannoch, with only a few side conversations explaining how their society functions on a more civilian level. Ascension shows how Quarian society is built on a strong sense of community, making the most of their limited space and belongings. Kaylee and her companions are some of the first non-Quarians to visit the Migrant Fleet in the 3 centuries since it was established, and it's easy to see the excitement in some of the Quarians at their visit, particularly from Sito, who is especially proud of being a Quarian and is happy to show off his home. Ascension also takes care to show a well-rounded look at the culture, portraying some Quarians as being unhappy about the visitors. Some give the cold shoulder because they are worried for the safety and health of themselves and their community. It's nice being able to take all this background knowledge into the games, helping to form an even stronger appreciation and interest in Quarians and the Migrant Fleet. It's interesting to consider that Ascension was published about 2 years before Mass Effect 2, which means that some fans were potentially introduced to Omega and the Migrant Fleet before seeing them firsthand in the game. The most shocking, though, is that Ascension was, for some, the first time meeting the Elusive Man. I can only imagine what this would have been like, since I played Mass Effect 2 before reading Ascension, and I would be remiss if I didn't say that my experience affected how I read the character in this novel. I could hear Martin Sheen's voice, I could see the Elusive Man's suit and blue eyes whenever he appeared in Ascension, and that made those scenes all the more compelling. If I tried to remove myself from my experience, I think I could still see how intriguing the character would be to someone who is meeting him for the first time reading the novel. He's menacing, and his very presence is always a cause of concern for Grayson. Grayson's thoughts about the Elusive Man help paint a clear picture of the character, which is very much in line with his portrayal in the trilogy. It's also interesting to get an early look at the hypocrisy inherent to the Elusive Man and Cerberus. This is best demonstrated by the reveal that Cerberus was behind the Eldfell Ashland incident, exposing human colonies to Element Zero. Cerberus is so forward about elevating humanity to new heights, but they are always so quick to slaughter humans to achieve that goal. It's great world building to introduce details like this in this novel. And as a side note, it was intriguing to pick up some hints that Udina was likely in Cerberus's pocket since the first game, maybe even before. The prominent motif in Ascension is the relationship between parents and their children. The most obvious one is between Paul Grayson and his daughter Jillian. His mission for the entire novel is to get her back, but the reasons for doing so are fuzzy to him because he's torn between his loyalty to Cerberus and his love for his daughter. To cope with the pain of no longer having Jillian to take care of, he becomes addicted to the drug Red Sand. When he finally sees that Cerberus is harming Jillian rather than helping her, he decides to abandon the organization to protect his daughter. This is only one example of a solidly crafted character arc and the thematic development in Ascension. Grayson has a problem, and he faces obstacles that bring him to a new understanding of himself and his situation. It's a bit basic on the surface, but there are times when this simplicity is cleverly used to great effect. There's a moment where the story builds up, making the reader think that Grayson will call Grissom Academy to check on Jillian, but instead, he calls the Elusive Man for orders. It's like he's addicted to being a Cerberus agent. Each time he completes an assignment and speaks with the Elusive Man, Grayson feels like it's an honor. But everything else about it is awful, and it makes his life worse, just like the Red Sand. At the end of the story, when Jillian's safety is ensured, Grayson calls the Elusive Man to tell him he's officially done with Cerberus, and he also shows signs of no longer using Red Sand. By the end, Grayson has kicked both of his addictions. The parent-child theme is cleverly echoed in other characters in the story as well. Kaylee sometimes ponders her complicated, distant relationship with her father John Grissom, which makes her feel more sympathetic toward Grayson wanting to connect with Jillian. Hendel's parents, who abandoned him when he was young, are referenced several times, motivating his distrust toward Grayson and his desire to protect Jillian. Grayson's subservience to the elusive man can even be read as an analogy to a father and a son. A weird extension of this theme appears in Kaylee's relationship with Jiro. At one point, she thinks to herself that she's a cradle robber, sleeping with someone nearly 20 years younger than she is. All of these dynamics converge to build a solid thematic unity across the story. While I enjoyed aspects of Ascension, I did have a few issues with the novel that put a damper on the experience. One of which is a problem with protagonists. It's challenging to nail down exactly who is the main character. Kaylee makes the most sense. She's presented as the protagonist on the back cover of the book, she's a returning character from Revelation, and she is in the majority of the scenes in the novel. However, she is much too passive to be a compelling protagonist. It feels like she's an observer in most situations, standing idly by while others take more decisive action. Most of the time, the plot happens around her, and she's just there to experience it. Kaylee is a highly intelligent and capable person, but she's often portrayed otherwise in the novel. For example, I found it very hard to believe that it took her so long to realize she hadn't told Jiro about Grissom being her father. The two weren't together very long, and she's always been protective of that information. The fact that she let her guard down so much feels at odds with who she is, as portrayed in Revelation and in Mass Effect 3. Kaylee also has very little agency in Ascension, which ultimately makes her feel like a weak protagonist, and it's not all too compelling to read. It's disappointing, especially knowing how capable and proactive she can be. It's not entirely fair to judge her based on her appearance in Mass Effect 3, where she kinda kicks ass, but I guess we can credit that to the lessons she learns in this novel. Still, I wish Kaylee were more like that in Ascension. Another issue I have with Ascension stems from one scene in particular, the cafeteria scene where Jillian's biotic abilities are unleashed. I'll admit I'm nitpicking a bit here, but it's quite uncomfortable to read nowadays. From a meta perspective of the Mass Effect franchise, the insensitive language and division of students into gender-based stereotypes comes across as backward and regressive. Portraying Grissom Academy's students as a bunch of boys slapping each other's backs, and the girls whispering and giggling to each other stands out in an awkward way. I find it hard to believe that children growing up in the world of Mass Effect would behave like this, acting out cliches that belong more to media from the 20th and early 21st centuries. Other Mass Effect stories go to great lengths to depict humanity as being largely unified after the Prothean discovery on Mars, making it clear that most of the petty differences humans once held against each other had dissolved. The concept of boys will be boys and girly girls just doesn't feel like a futuristic sci-fi social dynamic. More importantly, it doesn't feel like Mass Effect to me. I'd like to discuss a few more cool things in Ascension, but they couldn't fit in any larger section, so here's a lightning round of awesome parts of this novel. I really like the time period in which the story takes place. The months immediately following Mass Effect 1 feel like a perfect stretch to tell stories in the Mass Effect universe, because it's relatively quiet. In other words, the parts of the timeline where Shepard isn't fighting off a galaxy-wide threat or making decisions that impact the Milky Way tend to be the most convenient and interesting places to set stories. Most of the other novels and comics do just this, often to great success. I also have to say how cool it is to spend more time at Grissom Academy. Reading more about it in Ascension gives me a greater appreciation for when we visit it in Mass Effect 3. It's a sign of terrific world building when the tie-in media elevates the content found in-game. The first mention of the Collectors being an Ascension is really interesting, but I have to admit the speculation about who they are definitely loses its luster after completing Mass Effect 2. It's a nitpick, but things like this don't really age well. To those who read this book before playing Mass Effect 2, it helped prime them for a mystery that the game delivers beautifully. Reading after playing Mass Effect 2, the descriptions of the collectors just seem quaint and made me think, wow, that's silly. It just isn't a fun section to read in retrospect. The gunfight in the Cerberus warehouse on Omega is a great action scene. I'm always impressed when I read combat scenes in Mass Effect books, because I go into them thinking there is no way to faithfully depict the feeling of combat gameplay, but then, scenes like this exist and blow my mind. It feels just like playing the games on hardcore or insanity difficulty, where you have to be even more careful in gunfights. Thanks for watching. If you end up checking out Ascension, please leave a comment to let me know what you think, and be sure to put appropriate spoiler warnings for your discussion. If you have any questions about the story or characters, please also feel free to leave a comment below, and I'll try to answer them or get around to them in a future video. If you liked this video, be on the lookout for my coverage of the other Mass Effect novels and comic books. I also have several theory videos coming, so stay tuned. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next one.